What the hell's going on with that damn bloody radar? Through the whine of the engines dragging the crawler out of muddy ravine, Bruno heard Noah's colourful, though low-tone profanity. The cyber monk from the conclave planet called Grace of God still retained, besides some useful implants, a rudimentary notion of decent speech. You can't just throw away a decade and a half of life in a cyber monastery. That meant Noah always lowered his voice whenever he started to pour out his rich stock of swearing. Bruno was curious to check where Noah had fallen when the crawler slid into the ravine, but the moment was too tense. The crawler was about to slip back, and the 4 view screens were next to useless. The vibro wipers had barely had time to shed the dirt before the cameras started to smudge again. Bruno drove the crawler more by instinct, intuitively guessing which pair of the 6 giant wheels should be turned and which should be revved up, so it had time to catch a patch of solid ground. The secondary flux intensity unit burned out. Lena's voice sounded muffled, on the edge of audibility. She was, as usual, almost waist-deep in one of the hardware cabinets, trying to find fault with a decrepit antique tester. Without the tachyon scanner, which prospectors used to call the radar, they could only rely on Bruno's driving skills and instincts. This method was only one step away from suicide in the jungles of the Electra. I'm going to check some more circuits, but it looks like this unit is the problem. And be so kind, Bruno, try not to flip us over, or I'll be cut in half by that damned slide door. Bruno didn't say a word. He wasn't in the mood for chit-chat. The crawler lurched to the top of the ravine, and the 2 forward wheels were almost off the ground. Bruno instantly reduced the speed on them to not tear up the ground on the edge of the precipice with their ribbed treads, and began gently, barely touching the sensitive control joysticks to add power to the remaining 4. The crawler crept up the slope with its nose 70 degrees to the horizon. Bruno held his breath. Even Noah behind him stopped cursing. Bruno increased the power as the middle pair of wheels came into contact with the slightly drier, denser ground at the top of the slope. The engines howled wildly. The crawler sprang forward, popped out of the ravine like a champagne cork, landed heavily in a thicket of thorn bushes, and rocked desperately on the springs, damping the inertia of the fall. Bruno idled the engines, and the howling died to a faint background grunt. The joysticks suddenly seemed very slippery, so sweaty were his hands. He wiped his palms on his pants and leaned back on the shabby back of the driver's seat. "Oh, you," Noah said, and muttered something incomprehensible from his exclusive vocabulary. There was no anger in his voice, though. "Well, you should have at least warned me." Bruno shrugged and said, "I'm sorry. I didn't know it would be so abrupt. At least we got out of the ravine. He damn well knew it would be like this, but it would make no difference." "We got out, and that's what matters," Noah said. "Sort of farted out from this mud pit, heh?" "Hey guys," came Lena's voice again, sounding tenser. "If you have finished exchanging pleasantries, can you get me out of the closet? I think I broke something." Bruno turned on the external speakers, and the cabin filled with the dry crackling of the spike flowers, which, closing for the night, dumped the excess static. Fortunately, there was such an excellent grounding device as the Jabberwocky sticking out in the middle of the thicket. The crawler was equipped with several independent grounding systems, pulse dischargers, graphite nanosheets embedded in the wheels, and trivial iron chains dragging along the ground. Without this, no machinery, except maybe steam engines, would have lasted an hour on Electra, where everything dead or living, from the atmosphere to each blade of grass, was pumped with static electricity. Sometimes even all those precautions won't help. and bad things happen. The electronics burnt out, any fuses melted, and if you drove stupidly into a grove of scorchers, the collective discharge of these plant batteries could burn the crawler and the crew to the ground. That must have been what happened to Nikolaides' drunken octopus last year. 2 weeks after its disappearance, a communications satellite picked up a burned area in the thick of the scorchers, just 30 kilometers from the fungi fields of the Hyperborean Plateau. Grandpa Nikolai must have wanted to take a shortcut to Aeolian ascent, and either, for some reason, failed to request satellite electrical reconnaissance or simply neglected its results. However, it was still unclear why he did not turn away from the edge after the first scorchers were discharged. And the same thing may have happened to Shaggy Stevens' Sleipnir, which went missing earlier this season. Stevens simply did not return from an opening raid, and since he never revealed his roots, no one even knew where to look for his remains. Prospector boasted that he was going to take the motherlode mycelium, but nobody could know which way he chose. "So," Lena said, not lifting her head from the workbench, littered with burned units, all kinds of electronic scrap, and a miserable collection of the worn factory and homemade tools. "We burned pretty hard, but the bridge fuses worked properly, and the adjacent blocks survived. That's the good news." Noah chopsticked another portion of noodles into his mouth, sucked in with a whistle all the excess, which was not in his mouth in the first run, and swallowed almost without chewing. On the grace of God, the monks vowed to devour food quickly, to not take time away from prayer and spreading piety in cyberspace. Bruno suspected that the order would be happy to transfer its acolytes to intravenous nutrition, but the magisters feared that the ordinary acolytes would completely lose touch with reality, turning into virtual zombies. "Okay, now give me the bad one," Noah said, tossing the disposable noodle bowl into the trash can. "Should I serve the eulogy now, or are we still holding out?" "We don't have a spare unit," Lena said, rummaging through the piles of electronic junk, occasionally wincing in pain. She hit hard with her ribcage against the comings of the closet. A nasty bruise, or maybe even a cracked rib. They wouldn't know for sure until they returned and got to a doctor. "So we'll have to resuscitate this one. I think I can do it in half an hour. It won't work very well, but it will. Even worse, there are only a few fuses left. 2 or 3 more big melts, and they'll run out. Then it's all over." Bruno glared at Noah. The cybermonk's eye implant pupils looked like 2 digital chasms. "We took an extra 200, Bruno said. "There didn't seem to be that many melts. Where did they all go?" "You took the pile of junk, not the fuses," said Lena tiredly. "You didn't want to take me to the dealer but tried to outsmart him with your own stupid half-brains, you morons. Of those 200, maybe a quarter is solid. The rest are just pieces of red ceramic. Now we have about 3 dozen left. Maybe a little more." Bruno looked at Noah again. It was the cyber monk who had insisted that the 2 of them go out to get extra fuses and some other supplies, leaving Lena to deal with the pre-launch inspection of the Jabberwocky. It was hard to argue as Noah took care of almost all the expenses of organizing the raid. Bruno's contribution was his driving skills and his father's old crawler. Lena was bringing the derelict machine to working condition. They cleared their accounts down to the pure void of countless zeros. It was an all-in raid for them. "I must rest. Tell me when it's ready," Noah said without expression, and his pupils tightened into lobed irises. Lena continued to work at the workbench, which immediately gave off a distinct whiff of soldering. There was nothing to do, and Bruno let himself relax a little. All the equipment of the mining crawlers incorporated a lot of fuses, connecting all electronic units. Without this cumbersome system, the first electric charge coming through the Jabberwocky's protection would have raced through the circuits, burning out everything in its path. Such discharges came from the electrified jungle every now and then. Prospectors called it the Green Wall, the lush Paleozoic thickets surrounding all myceliums with almost impenetrable natural fortifications. The only way to get to the precious crystal mushrooms was to fight through a swampy green mess that constantly fired electric discharges at you. Flying in Electra's atmosphere was impossible. It was a certified electrical hell, constantly flashing with powerful thunderstorms like a broken planet-size stroboscope. The orbital shuttles could only take off and land at the poles, where zones of relative electrical tranquility had formed by some whim of local nature. Radio communication was as predictable as a roll of dice. You could never guess whether your signal would break through it. Crawler raids were also almost as dangerous. You could catch a supercharge from which no protection would help. You could lose your navigation equipment and wander through the jungle until you ran out of food, fuses, or fuel. You could get stuck in a swamp, fall into a cave, into a river, or, as Jabberwocky just did, slide into a muddy ravine. The death rate among prospectors was close to 30%. Only the most skilled and lucky survived. Bruno was lucky. He already had 8 raids on his list. Noah was the only one among the living prospectors who went mushroom hunting more than Bruno. He had already made through 11. The last few raids for both of them were empty, though. The gathered crystal mushrooms didn't even cover the expenses, so they decided to go all in, going on a raid to the most dangerous and therefore potentially rich mycelium in the Aeolian Plateau, the Great Mycelium, the Motherlode. And now they barely had enough fuses left for the return trip, and the plateau was still 2 days away. Lena put down the tools and held the freshly assembled unit. "Well," she said, "let's put this stuff in place, and off we go. The question is, where to?" Noah moved, and his pupils dilated. "Make a course on the 48th beacon," he said, turning to Bruno. "Maybe we can contact Orbiter and ask for a parcel." He reached out, pulled the silver cable from his chair, and plugged the connector into the socket on his neck. Bruno clicked a few toggle switches and took hold of the joysticks while Lena slammed the repaired unit back into place. Crawler was stubbornly pushing through the jungle, crushing the grassy giants that were constantly pelting the Jabberwocky with bursts of static discharges. The defenses have held up so far. Noah's sophisticated implants allowed them to use the cheapest scanner and the rudimentary data processing unit. Noah did all the processing, displaying a perfect image on the screen. The terrain 100 meters ahead. Big trunks, clusters of scorchers, as clear as the best scanner you can buy. If it hadn't been for Noah, the screen would have been a hellish mishmash of blurry images and lines. The scanner captured everything, down to every thorn and pothole. These implants chained Noah to Electra more securely than any shackles. Most Federation planets demanded that such enhancements be either licensed or removed to get a residence permit. Having escaped the grace of God, Noah made his way illegally to Electra with the smugglers, but got stuck. Both orbital stations were controlled by the Federation customs. Removing the Order's implants was impossible, and the license cost insane amounts of money. Noah was already in his 4th year of Prospectors Roulette, but the cherished sum was as far away as the Andromeda Galaxy. The Federation was suspicious about cyber monks trying to settle down on its core planets, and the money was the best civilized excuse to keep them out. Lena, an orphan who had spent her childhood in the workshop owned by Bruno's father, was a very talented technician. She dreamed of going to a major university and becoming an engineer. Without startup capital, her chances of doing so were nil. The times of equal opportunities were somewhere in the same place as the pharaohs of the Third Dynasty and the First Moon Republic. Her first two raids had barely covered the expenses. She had nowhere to go back to. Everything was sold, even the shabby house on the outskirts of northern settlement. Bruno wondered why he was here. He had no desire to go anywhere, no ambition to do anything but drive a crawler through the wild jungles of the Green Wall. True, soon the last of the myceliums would die, and the biologists would learn to cultivate crystal mushrooms, but until that happened, he would sit behind the joysticks of the Jabberwocky. "I see the beacon," Noah said. "Estimated time of contact is 16 minutes. Can you cut it a bit?" Bruno nodded, instantly realizing Noah couldn't see him. The cybermonk's visual cortex was now transmitting data from the scanner. If they managed to break through the atmosphere static with the powerful beacon antenna, contact the orbital station, and request a parcel, a small disposable lander with fuses, they might hope to make it to the plateau. Otherwise, they would have little chance of ever returning. Finally, Jabberwocky broke out with the engine howling on a small glade. In the middle of it was the beacon, a massive 60-meter metal harpoon dropped from the satellite and deeply embedded in the soil. The top of it was crowned by a flirty hat of a powerful antenna, and somewhere in its core were several containers of radioactive material, a radar target for scanners. But it wasn't the beacon that instantly caught the attention of all three prospectors. An 8-wheeled crawler, already covered in sparkling lichen, was standing beside it. Through the greenish overgrowth, an image of an 8-legged horse was visible on the side of the crawler. "It's Sleipnir," Lena said. She stuck her head between Bruno's and Noah's chairs, looking at the front view screen. "Oh my God. So they are here. Stevens and Torstein and—" Her voice broke off. The third crew member of Sleipnir was Sven Kritten. Lena and Sven wanted to get married and go off to university together. Noah pulled the cable out from the neck, and his face immediately appeared human. "The hatches are open," he said. "We should go take a look." Noah and Lena went to inspect the Sleipnir. Bruno, as was customary with prospectors, remained at the controls. The driver was the most indispensable part of the team. Noah transmitted the picture from his eye implants to the crawler. It was possible at such close distances and away from the electric thickets. Bruno watched what was happening, switching the image to a small black and white screen they had installed for such rare occasions. It was obvious that the crawler had been here for a long time. Electra had no noticeable fauna, but the vegetation had already begun to conquer the interior of the Sleipnir. Bruno looked through the eyes of Noah at the picture of growing desolation. "Come down. It's safe," Noah said. Bruno heard the footsteps as Lena descended the gangway. "Where are they?" Lena came into view. "Did you find them?" "Sort of," said Noah. "You can see for yourself. I'm sorry. Let's go check around." The image rotated and moved to the cabin of the crawler. There was less vegetation there, but the impression of desolation remained. Noah moved his head from side to side, looking around. The engineers' and drivers' chairs were empty, but the navigators— "Oh God!" Lena rushed up from behind Noah. "Sven, no!" She swung the chair around, and her helmet light flashed through the darkness, uncovering the face of a dried-up corpse, horrible, surrounded by scalding black locks of hair. "It's not Kritten," Noah said. "It's Shaggy Stevens." Lena knelt down beside the dead man. "Noah, look, he shot himself." In a patch of light, Bruno saw the gun on the floor and a neat black hole in the corpse's forehead. Lena carefully pulled a piece of paper from the dead man's breast pocket and read it. "There's nothing more to wait for. Thorstein and Sven are gone. Choke on it, you bastard, if you find it." She turned to Noah. "What does that mean?" "Apparently their crawler broke down, and they couldn't contact the orbital station," Noah said. "So they decided to kill themselves. I'm sorry, Lena." Lena stared into Noah's face. From how the image on the screen changed, Bruno realized that Noah's eye implant filters had kicked in, cutting out the bright light of the flashlight. "They took their chances to get to the mother lode," Noah said, "but failed at the last moment." Lena turned sharply. The image flickered and faded for a moment. Then, when the picture cleared again, Noah was on his way to follow Lena, who was peering into the cargo hold. "My God," came Lena's trembling voice. I've never seen such a crop. There are millions here, tens of millions." The light of Noah's headlamp flashed from behind Lena's shoulder, and Bruno saw what she was looking at. The spacious, twice as big as on the Jabberwocky, cargo compartment of the Sleipnir was crammed with vacuum packs of sparkling iridescent contents, the spore-bearing part of crystal mushrooms. An unsurpassed neurostimulator and revitalizer with no side effects, whose fame was spreading across the galaxy at about the same rate as its supply on Electra was running out. A couple of dozen kilograms of it was considered a very successful haul. There were several tons of it here. "Stevens has a big family," Lena said quietly. "So does Torstein. We have to give it to them. We'll pack it into Jabberwocky and bring it back home. They deserve it." The image twitched a little. Bruno realized that Noah had shaken his head. "I don't think so," Cybermonk said. "I'm sorry, Lena." Lena turned around. "We have to!" she shouted. The image twitched again. "No." Bruno was petrified in his chair. Something terrible was happening in the dead Sleipnir, but he didn't understand what, and more importantly, he didn't know what to do. What were they talking about? Was Noah out of his mind? Lena slowly handed Noah a scrap of paper, the Shaggy Stevens suicide note. "There's one more phrase here," she said. "The last one. It says, 'Damn you, Noah.'" "I was damned a long time ago," Noah said slowly. "I'm sorry." A shot rang out, and Lena dropped down like a puppet with the strings cut off. A hand appeared in Noah's field of vision with a gun, the same weapon Stevens had shot himself with. "Wow, it worked," Noah said. "Good stuff, solid." He looked at Lena, dead, lying by the spore stack, and threw the gun on the floor. "Pity it came to this, but I need this crop for myself." Bruno stared at the screen in silence. "Can you hear me?" Noah asked. "Don't you get too downhearted. You're a tough boy, and smart too. Your share will be enough to get out of this bloody dynamo hell of a planet. We'll load the crop and figure out what to tell about this on our way back." Bruno didn't say anything. "Lost your words, eh? That's all right. You'll wake up. Once we start loading the spores, I promise you'll be alive and kicking." Bruno was silent. His hands wandered aimlessly over the control panel until they finally grasped the control joysticks as if they were lifelines. Noah began to climb out of the dead crawler as he spoke. "You think I'm some sort of cold-blooded bastard? No, I'm sorry. I really am. She was a nice girl. I'm even sorry about that jerk, Stevens. I was the one who intercepted his signal to the orbiter. He told me all about the accident and the harvest. He promised half to whoever got him out. I promised to save him. And then I burned out the antenna on the beacon. I can't make it with the half, you see. 3/4 is another matter. 1/4 of 30 million is enough for you, kiddo." He jumped off the Sleipnir's outer ramp and onto the soft ground, turning to the Jabberwocky. "Come on, bring the crawler up. We'll load up. You're a smart guy, I know." Bruno gripped his joysticks so hard that his joints hurt. "No," he said. "I'm very stupid." The engines roared furiously, and Bruno saw on the small screen, through Noah's eyes, how the Jabberwocky's giant wheels spurted fountains of soil. And then the massive machine leaped forward rapidly, just as they had in the ravine, and instantly obscured his entire field of vision. Then, like an ancient battering ram, the car slammed violently into the side of the Sleipnir, right where Noah stood. The cyber monk barely had time to blink with his implants. Bruno sat in the ringing silence for a few seconds, then stood up, pulled on his safe suit, and climbed out of the Jabberwocky. Ignoring what was stuck in the mangled metal between the two crawlers, Bruno climbed aboard the Sleipnir, climbed down the gangway, and opened the hatch to the flamethrower turret without looking into the cargo bay. He disconnected the feed hose from the nozzle and threw it down. It was just long enough to reach the threshold of the cargo bay. Bruno unscrewed the valve, and a puddle of thick lilac sludge immediately started splashing across the floor. Bruno walked carefully to avoid stepping into the pool and exited the crawler again. Removing the flare from the safe suit belt, he set the ignite delay for 3 minutes and threw the flare down into the hatch, where the flammable mixture was gurgling from the hose. Then he climbed back into the Jabberwocky and yanked it out of the corroded side of the Sleipnir with a screech. As a mighty column of fierce orange flame erupted from the dead crawler's open hatch, Bruno turned the Jabberwocky around and drove into the electric inferno of the green wall.